September 3rd, 1967 was a big day for Sweden. Höger trafikomläggningen. I know I butchered that pronunciation, so let's go with the simpler Dagen H. It was the day the country switched from driving on the left side of the road to the right side. It was, predictably, absolute chaos, but the act of switching sides isn't what stands out to me the most. It's that it happened in 1967. Cars were very common in 1967. There were, at the time, 1,976,248 registered vehicles in Sweden. With that many cars on the road, switching sides was a logistical nightmare. It took a month and military involvement to change signs and markings overnight, not to mention manage the nearly 2 million drivers grappling with the change. So if everything was set up for left-hand driving, why change sides at all? Why did Sweden change driving sides in 1967? To get to the bottom of this one, we need to talk about ancient Rome, the British Empire, Napoleon, the Second World War, freight transport, and the Ford Model T. What's up, everyone? If you're new here, welcome on in. I'm Amy, this is Pete, and Pete would like to know, have you... That's 100% cat for have you hit that sub button yet. I'm an historian, author, speaker, and sometimes TV personality, and Pete's leaving, and also a streamer. If you're into chill video games with rants, I stream 3 days a week on twitch.tv/thespacevixen. In short, I do a lot of things, and I'm interested in a lot of things, and today, that's the story of Dagen H. If you're living in North America, which my analytics tell me is the case for around 67% of my audience, you're accustomed to sitting on the left side of the car and driving on the right side of the road. At least 15% of my audience is used to the opposite, sitting on the right side of the car to drive on the left. Whichever side you're on, it's possible you've never done the other. I've done both. Granted, I've only driven on the left for about 3 hours in the bush in Australia, so it wasn't exactly intense city driving. But it was hard. My eyes naturally go up and right for the rearview mirror, not left. I felt very unsure about where my wheels were, so was constantly checking my side mirrors. My brain saw oncoming traffic and freaked out we were going to crash before I remembered that cars are supposed to be on my right. I can't imagine how hard it would be to suddenly have to change driving sides, especially in areas that are familiar. So what's the deal with driving sides anyways? We have to start this story asking why about 35% of the world's population drives on the left side of the road. And like so many facets of modern life, our story starts with ancient civilizations. Because, well, the car is a modern machine. Roads have been around for centuries. Archaeological evidence tells us that ancient Romans drove their carts and chariots on the left side of the road, though the why is unclear. Experts say the most likely reason is safety and self-defense. As most people are right-handed, about 90% of the population, driving on the left meant their dominant hand was free to hold a weapon. For all the drive-by stabbings the ancient Romans apparently loved so much. Another likely explanation is that, again, the predominantly right-handed population held their horses' reins with the right hand to whip with the left hand, so driving on the left eliminated the chances of accidentally whipping oncoming drivers. The same was true for riders. A right-handed person can more easily mount a horse from the left, particularly if wearing a sword on their left side for ease of grasping for all those ride-by stabbings. Riding on the left means mounting and dismounting safely on the side of the road rather than in traffic. This left side dominant custom carried over into the medieval era and spread throughout Europe, but for a long time driving was unregulated. Driving side customs varied by region, though many did favor driving on the left. It wasn't until the 18th century that things started getting a bit firmed up. In 1773, the British government passed the General Highways Act that encouraged driving on the left. The Highway Act of 1835 turned that encouragement into law. And it wasn't just in Britain. The British Empire by this time was spread around the globe, and driving preferences were part of that influence. British territories, including modern-day Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and India, all adopted left-side driving. But things were different elsewhere in Europe. French custom towards the end of the 18th century saw the aristocracy traveling on the left side of the road, forcing the peasants to yield to the right. But after the French Revolution of 1789, nobles joined the peasants on the right so they wouldn't stick out as much. Paris introduced a keep right rule in 1794, and it wasn't the first. Denmark had done the same a year earlier in 1793, and Russia's Empress Elizabeth had issued a keep right edict in 1752. France's keep right rule spread under Napoleon's reign. In the early 1800s, the self-crowned Emperor of France engaged in a series of conflicts throughout Europe to affirm his supremacy in the region, and also largely to disrupt the British Empire. The Napoleonic Wars saw France conquer the Low Countries like Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, as well as Switzerland, some German states, Poland, and parts of Spain and Italy. And his influence forced them all to adopt the keep right rule. Countries who resisted Napoleon's conquests, Britain, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Portugal, retained their left side custom. Around the same time, left-driving Sweden ceded Finland to right-driving Russia after the Finnish War. While Swedish custom remained for a time, an 1858 Imperial Russian decree forced Finland to swap sides. Europe was thus divided, and so was North America. Native American groups in what is today the United States and Canada didn't all live in large permanent settlements. In the north, many banded together in smaller family groups and moved around with their tents and lean-tos in tow. Further south, where the weather was more hospitable year-round, populations lived near rivers and lakes in villages, many of which had a localized government. The largest cities in the Americas were still further south, the Aztec and Mayan empires in modern Mexico and the northern parts of South America. But unlike their Greek and Roman contemporaries, Mesoamericans didn't have large riding animals or use the wheel for transportation or farming. They may have traveled on one side of the road, but sidedness for driving really came as part of the Europeans' arrival on the continent. The first Europeans came from England, France, and Spain. Thus, travel customs were split between both sides. English colonies first adopted the left-driving rule, but after gaining independence from the British Empire in the Revolutionary War, those now American states began changing sides as a way to further separate from their previous rulers. French colonies, on the other hand, already had a right-driving influence. In 1792, more or less coincident with Britain's General Highways Act and on the cusp of the Napoleonic Wars, a law requiring drivers to keep right was passed in Pennsylvania. Similar laws were put in place in New York in 1804 and New Jersey in 1813. Right-sided driving turned out to work nicely for the newly independent United States. Soon after the first traffic laws were passed, the agriculture industry grew to a point where farmers were transporting products in large enough quantities to require transport by multiple pairs of horses. The driver at the helm of this freight shipment didn't have a seat, but they tended to ride on the left rear horse to control the rest with their dominant right hand. As traffic increased, the arrangement of sitting on the left and driving on the right had the benefit of putting the driver near the center line, allowing them a better vantage point to avoid collisions. This sit-left, drive-right arrangement was solidified in the early 20th century as automobiles began replacing horse-drawn carts. And as the United States took an early lead in this new industry, it set a standard. 1886 is widely considered the birth year of the car, with the Benz Motorwagen as the first gas-powered internal combustion engine vehicle. But the first mass-produced automobile that was accessible to the wider population was Henry Ford's Model T. It had the steering wheel on the left, necessitating driving on the right. This also put the passenger on the right side, which meant that they could enter and exit the vehicle from the pavement rather than into traffic. And since this reliable and economical car was exported, countries importing the Model T changed their rules of the road when the driving era began. Canada gained independence from Britain on July 1, 1867, when the British North American Act made the Dominion of Canada a self-governing entity within the British Empire. It was independent but retained holdovers from its previous British rule, and still does, by the way. We spell words like color and honor properly with the letter U, and we have the Queen on our currency. In the early 20th century, one of those holdovers was driving on the left, but only in some places. Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba always drove on the right, but British Columbia and the Maritime provinces drove on the left. So not only was a part of the country at odds with its only neighbor, the country was at odds within itself. The increase of road traffic across borders and the accessibility of imported cars from the United States forced a change. The interior of British Columbia was the first to adopt right-side driving on July 15th of 1920. The Maritimes followed in 1924. Newfoundland was the outlier, driving on the left until January 2nd, 1947, 2 years before it became a province of Canada. Canada is interesting because it was in a similar situation to Sweden 40 years before the European country changed sides. So let's go back to Europe. Coincident with the Otto era, the remaining left-driving countries in Europe changed slowly. Madrid ordered the change throughout Spain in 1924. Italy's right driving became standard countrywide by 1926. Portugal and its territories switched in 1928. The dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918 didn't actually bring about much change. Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Hungary continued driving on the left, while Austria was a weirdly mixed bag. Half the country drove left and half drove right. The dividing line was exactly where Napoleon's conquest got him in 1805. Then the Second World War changed things. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Hitler ordered the country switch sides overnight, a chaotic undertaking that was not up for negotiation. Czechoslovakia and Hungary similarly changed sides after being invaded by Germany in 1939 and late 1944, respectively. By the end of the Second World War, left-driving Sweden was an outlier in Europe, and like Canada's left-driving provinces in the 1920s, that was problematic. Its border countries drove right, and with small roads connecting countries, it was a potentially dangerous task for drivers to recall what side they were meant to be on in border towns. Another issue was that the cars most commonly imported put the driver on the left for right-side driving. And also, the largest Swedish car manufacturers at the time, like Volvo, built cars with the driver on the left for right-side driving for ease of export to the rest of Europe. That meant many Swedes drove on the left from the left side of the car. Instead of being able to see the center line of the road, they drove looking at the sidewalk or into a ditch. As the number of registered drivers increased, there were concerns that this arrangement was responsible for the rising number of traffic accidents, both in the country and along its borders. So the country finally considered switching sides. In 1955, a national referendum was held on the matter of right-side driving, and the result was that 82.9% of Swedes opposed the change. The Swedish parliament ultimately overruled the populace and passed a law converting to right-side driving in 1963. The change wasn't overnight. Well, technically it was, but the groundwork took a solid month. All signage and road markings had to be changed, and the government needed a plan to manage everything. It was an absolutely massive effort that brought in the army to help. The change finally took place on Sunday, September 3rd, 1967 at 5 o'clock in the morning. It was Dagen H, or H-Day, H standing for högertrafik, the Swedish word for right-hand traffic. All private cars were prohibited from being on the road from 1 a.m. to 6 a.m. to give authorities time to rearrange signs. Once cars were back on the road, the speed limit was very low and slowly raised as drivers became more comfortable. Interestingly, Sweden wasn't the latest country to change. Iceland followed suit in 1968, Nigeria, a former British colony, swapped in 1972, and Ghana changed in 1974. Pakistan considered switching to right-side driving in the 1960s, but decided against it. Camel traffic was common, and drivers weren't keen on retraining their caravans. On September 7, 2009, the independent state of Samoa, which is not American Samoa, changed from right-side driving to the left. The Prime Minister decided on the change for ease of importing cheap cars from left-driving Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. So that's it. That's the rabbit hole I went down after seeing this picture, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you're into all kinds of weird history, definitely hit that subscribe button because that's what we do here, with an emphasis on the mid-century. And between uploads, you can catch me on Twitch 3 days a week, chatting about what I'm working on or just what I'm thinking about while I play mostly retro video games. I think that's all I've got for today. Have a great rest of your day, everyone, and I'll see you next time.